Good evening. You're watching Left, Right and Centre. I'm Nidhi Razdan. We're here to talk about day one of President Trump's visit to India. The optics were all in place. More than 1 lakh people at the Motera Stadium in Gujarat to welcome him. And the President went on to make a speech in which he was effusive in his praise for the Prime Minister and for India. Announcing that defence deals worth $3 billion would be signed tomorrow, the US President also talked about the threat of radical Islamic terrorism faced by both countries. But he also praised Pakistan for taking action against terror groups, saying the US had very good relations with Islamabad, and then went on to gently nudge India to start talks with Pakistan. Mr. Trump talked about India's religious diversity, how India's unity has been an inspiration to the world. And continuing his charm offensive, he also talked about Bollwyood films, Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli. These are some of the highlights of his speech today.
India is the country where hundreds of millions of light candles to celebrate the triumph of good over evil at Diwali. And it's where, just days from now, Indians of all faiths will pour out onto the streets to celebrate the beautiful festival of Holi. India is a country that proudly embraces freedom, liberty, individual rights, the rule of law, and the dignity of every human being. Your nation has always been admired around the earth as the place where millions upon millions of Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Jains, Buddhists, Christians, and Jews worship side by side in harmony. Yet you have always stood strong as one great Indian nation. My administration is working in a very positive way with Pakistan to crack down on the terrorist organizations and militants that operate on the Pakistani border. Our relationship with Pakistan is a very good one. Thanks to these efforts, we are beginning to see signs of big progress with Pakistan, and we are hopeful for reduced tensions, greater stability, and the future of harmony for all of the nations of South Asia. India's rise as a prosperous and independent nation is an example to every nation all over the world, and one of the most outstanding achievements of our century. There is all the difference in the world between a nation that seeks power through coercion, intimidation, and aggression, and a nation that rises by setting its people free and unleashing them to chase their dreams, and that is India. The life of Prime Minister Modi underscores the limitless promise of this great nation. He started out by his father's side as a chiwala, a tea seller. When he was a young man, he worked at a cafeteria in this city. Today, Prime Minister Modi is the tremendously successful leader of this vast Indian republic. All over the planet, people take great joy in scenes of Bhangra, music, dance, romance, and drama, and classic Indian films like DDLJ and Showjay. This is the country where your people cheer on some of the world's greatest cricket players, from Sachin Tendulkar to Virat Kohli.
There's a separate thread on how Donald Trump pronounced a lot of things in that speech, but nevertheless, it is a speech that has generally gone down well here in India. Let's talk about what the President had to say and what to expect tomorrow. Here in the studio with us, Ambassador Meera Shankar is back with us. She was our ambassador to the United States. We have Jeff Smith, Research Fellow for South Asia at the Heritage Foundation, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Maya Michandani is with us, Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and Assistant Professor at Ashoka University. Alyssa Iris joins us from Washington, D.C. via Skype, Senior Fellow for India-Pakistan in South Asia at the Council for Foreign Relations. And Professor Ashutosh Vashni is also with us from Brown University, Director of the India Initiative there. Ambassador Meera Shankar, to you first. How did you think day one went?
I think it's gone better than expected. It's gone very well. because there's always some level of anxiety whether, there may be something unpredictable which emerges, but that didn't happen. I think President Trump's speech pressed all the right buttons as far as India is concerned. He made a mention of Mahatma Gandhi, of Vivekananda, of Sardar Patel, of certain current popular sports people, Sachin Tendulkar and Virat Kohli, of Bollwyood. And then I think the important thing is he also said that India has achieved what it has, the progress that it has through democracy and in a peaceful way. And he compared this to other countries which have, not really
maybe
followed such
China,
a peaceful.
which is what many of us
well,
thought.
he didn't name any country, but clearly it's a question of, assessing India's democratic model as offering an alternative to authoritarianism, which was seen as having increasing appeal after the global financial crisis.
That's actually a very important point that you make, and I'd like to ask Alyssa Iris about that. The fact that the president, did talk about India's religious diversity, the fact that India is admired because of the unity of this country and people living together, emphasizing India's credentials as a democracy, was that a sort of a positive way in which he was trying to get a message across on the issue of religious minorities, etc., which is what senior US administration officials had said a little more bluntly would be raised in public and private comments on this visit?
Right. Thanks, Nidhi. I think it was a little bit of both. I think it was both providing that sense of the role that many geostrategic experts in the United States now see India as playing, as a balancer, a contrast to the type of rise we're now seeing with China, and India that as an open democracy can play a role as a very, what people refer to as the long pole in the tent of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. But you're right, to the extent that it was a comment on the importance of India's great diversity and the way that India has maintained its democracy, its accomplishment over the years, I think it was to some extent a nudge in that direction as well.
Jeff Smith, your take on that and on this particular point about India's diversity, democracy, and also the personal praise for the Prime Minister. That also stood out, his gestures, to sort of highlight Mr. Modi's background. How important is personal chemistry with Donald Trump, firstly, according to you?
Well, I think it's very important, and I think over time he's shown that he and Prime Minister Modi have very good personal chemistry. There have been a lot of photo opportunities between them where they've shown a lot of warmth, a lot of hugs. Frankly, President Trump laughing. That's not something you always see in his interactions with other world leaders. And I think that was on display again today. I want to give credit to his speechwriters. I think they did their homework. I think they were able to hit all the right notes. I think the president stayed on message. He was very disciplined. And I think he forwarded a vision that was aspirational and somewhat idealistic. And he sort of cleverly drew contrasts with some of India's neighbors that are not democratic, that are not free, that are not responsible players on the international stage. And from all indications so far, I think the speech has been very well received here in Delhi.
So it's clear, Professor Varshney, that India's democracy and its foundation as a democracy, therefore, is very, very important. And when the president, as he's here in India, we've also seen some very unfortunate protests in Delhi. 2 people are dead today. A policeman has died. A civilian has died in these protests over the Citizenship Amendment Act. In a sense, does this reinforce that more than ever, not because outsiders are telling us to, but that we as a country need to stand up for that very democracy, that constitution that the entire world admires us for, and that we need to be proud of?
Yes, I think to me, the 2 of the strongest themes in President Trump's quite spectacular speech, I thought, were the comparison, without mentioning China, the comparison of India and China. These are very powerful phrases he was using. There is all the difference in the world between a nation that seeks power through coercion, intimidation, and aggression, and a nation that rises by setting its people free and unleashing them to chase their dreams. This is a very, very strong part of the speech. And also the second a very strong part of the speech was, I noted 3 references to India's religious diversity, other than democracy, 3 references, including a rather evocative sacred bank of the Ganges, the Golden Temple, and the Jama Masjid, all in sort of in succession, as well as all religions worshipping side by side peacefully together. And it goes on, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Jews, etc. Now, yes, the fact that violence took place in northeast Delhi near Shadra is quite regrettable. We don't know who was responsible, but surely many Indians would like to recommit themselves or would like to emphasize the diversity that they've always India believed in, and would like to preserve it.
Well, let me move this, though, to some of the other aspects of the speech, Maya. And on the messaging on Pakistan, there were loud cheers when he talked about the fact that Pakistan needed to act against terror groups, and then there was silence when he said, well, we have very good relations with Pakistan, etc. How do you think that has played out, and the sort of subtle messaging that maybe it's time to start talking?
Well, I mean, I think a couple of things. One is that broadly, the fact that this visit is taking place in the manner, at the scale that it's taken place, against the backdrop of pretty bad press that India has got internationally over the last 5 to 6 months, is almost sort of a validation of Indian domestic policy in a sense, or a vindication, whichever way you want to see it, for the Modi-led BJP government. I mean, but I think on Pakistan things get a little tricky, because while there may be that validation or that sense of vindication in Delhi, you know, the current regime has drummed up a sense of, I mean, Pakistan in any case evokes a sense of sort of nationalism and patriotism and things like that, but this drumming up of, you know, go to Pakistan, for example. Anybody who's antithetical to the administration is told to go to Pakistan. And here you have this great friend of India, Donald Trump, who's also a great friend of the Prime Minister, saying, forget going to Pakistan, but talk to Pakistan. And let's start somewhere. And Pakistan is a great friend of the United States. So, you know, as you pointed out, that we heard the cheers when he talked about fighting radical Islamist terrorism, and then immediately after that, when he said Pakistan is a great friend, there was a little bit of a silence from the crowd. I think that's really what it is, because if you look at where the India-Pakistan relationship is today, there isn't one. I mean, there isn't a conversation. And so when a foreigner comes to India, when an international leader comes to India and says, in the region, these are the issues that need addressing, you have one large gaping hole where nobody's talking to each other. And I mean, I don't know how this will play out tomorrow in Hyderabad House. I think one will have to see what comes of it. But I do think that regional stability, which we hear the United States talk about very often, and India being a key player in regional stability, that regional stability cannot happen if India and Pakistan don't talk to each other in some format.
In fact, talking about regional stability, given that the president is here just before the peace deal with the Taliban is being signed, you know, the timing of that, how far high of the agenda do you think Afghanistan and therefore the regional situation will be in the discussions tomorrow? I figure quite high.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. You know, President Trump has from the very beginning been quite insistent that he would like to seek an end to the conflict in Afghanistan. I think he's in part reflecting some of the fatigue and frustration among the American public with the conflict there. And he's been pursuing in earnest some kind of negotiated settlement with the Taliban. I think he did send a fairly important signal last year, however, that he views a bad deal as worse than no deal, that he's not going to cut a deal with the Taliban at the expense of U.S. national security interests. And if they don't believe it's a good deal, it's not going to happen. And right now, they want to see a good faith effort from the Taliban that they are not only willing to stop violence, but are capable of enforcing a ceasefire and stopping violence among their own factions, which they hope will then open the door to the holy grail of negotiations, which is intra-Afghan negotiations. And so I think it's still very early on. We're still at the first stage of a long and difficult multi-stage process, but the process is moving, and the timing is interesting.
It is interesting. Alyssa Iris, you've written extensively about India and the US and the trade relationship, but given that there is no trade deal happening on this trip, do you think there is enough else that the visit will produce that would make it a success in terms of outcomes? Is it enough? Perhaps a deal for 6 nuclear reactors, these defense agreements that the president has talked about today?
I think all of these deliverables that have been previewed from Friday forward would be important in any kind of a state visit. So, if Westinghouse and NPCIL can actually sign an MOU that advances what has long been a lingering and unfulfilled part of the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal, this is now going on more than a decade old, that will be a big deal. Defense procurement of more than $3 billion, if you put together the $2.6 billion for the naval helicopters, the Seahawks, and the possibility of another round of Apaches helicopters, that's important. It emphasizes the maritime security dimension of the defense and strategic partnership, so that does matter. Is it disappointing that we haven't managed to come to any agreement, at least one that's announceable or presentable as a trade deal, on even a small handful of the long list of issues that the United States and India have had frictions on, some for a very long time, some more new in the last couple of years? That is, of course, disappointing. I hope the trade negotiators are going to be able to keep at it and come up with something, even if it's small, that will open the door to continued negotiations. I mean, the only way you ever reach agreement is to keep trying. So I hope that there's some goalposts at which they can work towards an additional deal that can be announced in the coming months.
Ambassador Shankar, just on that issue of outcomes, are we also stuck in this trap where we expect every US presidential visit to produce a nuclear deal?
Well, I don't think that's possible because,
Exactly.
these are kind of seminal agreements which happen at inflection points in the relationship. And when that transition is made, you're not going to get such a kind of a transformative agreement. What you can hope for, though, in each of these visits is that as the relationship has matured, you will be able to keep moving forward and to build on the foundations that have been laid.
There will be challenges, of course.
To give you an example, we signed the first MOU on cooperation in counterterrorism when I was there as ambassador, and we identified, sharing of intelligence, sharing of information, experience sharing as the main areas and training where we would cooperate. Now, clearly at that time, I think our agencies were still new to this whole process of cooperation. And there was, I think, some hesitation on both sides as to the degree they would be willing to use this framework for cooperation. But as the agencies have learned to work more with each other, I think the level of trust has increased. And now you are looking not just at these sharing of intelligence, which has become, I think, more substantive than it was, or training, but we're also looking at upgradation of technology for security purposes, which was not part of the original agenda. And perhaps we may have an MOU on counterterrorism cooperation,
yes,
which
builds
a
training center
on all this.
Yeah.
So similarly in defense, if you take a look, we were not buying any equipment from the US during the Cold War. There were issues. The US didn't want to sell to us. They wouldn't give us spare parts. There was no transfer of technology.
Yeah.
But times have changed, and really, as I said, the end of the Cold War.
But it is interesting that despite that, India has sort of maintained its independence vis-a-vis its relationship with Iran, for example, or with Russia, despite US pressure to the contrary. One last comment from Professor Varshney and from Maya. Professor Varshney, just on this whole issue of whether the visit has turned out to be more of a spectacle rather than anything substantive. Some would say that with a president like Mr. Trump, spectacle is part of the substance, frankly. You have to massage his ego. He wants a big crowd, you give him a big crowd. It's not 10 million people, it's 1 lakh people, but so what?
2 points about that. One, there is no doubt that the spectacular, the glamorous, the theatrical are very important to him, as they are to Mr. Modi, actually. But I think we might want to touch upon the Indian-American angle a little, Nidhi. We haven't done that so far. Here is what he said about Indian Americans. Truly spectacular people, titans of business, pioneers of science, masters of arts, innovators of technology. And if you only think of 4 million Indian Americans constituting 4 million people in America, just roughly 1%, little over, then the political significance of Indian Americans does not come out clearly. But if you think of the American presidential elections, as you should, not as a national average. After all, Mr. Trump lost by 3 million votes, but he won presidency because states are extremely important in presidential college. And if you think of the states which he won very narrowly, let me just briefly mention, we don't have time. Florida, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, he won by a margin of 1% plus minus. 1% plus minus. These are big states. And Texas, according to American political scientists, is likely to go purple. It's no longer solidly Republican. In these states, how Indian Americans vote, and they have voted 80% and above for Democrats for quite some time. In these states, how Indian Americans vote can make a difference.
That's an important point.
We can't be sure about that, but probabilistically speaking, it can make a difference. So I think we should bring that aspect of also into equation and into our discussion.
Last comment, Maya, just on the spectacle substance. Did you enjoy the spectacle?
I'll reserve comment on some of what I saw. But I think as Professor Varshney pointed out, both Donald Trump and Narendra Modi like the spectacle. They like the crowds. They like to be able to go out and speak to people themselves. I think as Ambassador Shankar also pointed out, the idea that there has to be a deliverable. I mean, I've seen some of the commentary, and some are arguing that the visit itself in an election year is a deliverable. It is a deliverable that tells you that the relationship is strong, it is robust in spite of differences, that they are two partners who share similar ideals or interests. I think the question really for me is this idea of shared values. As India and America grew closer over the last 20 years, we always heard about the world's largest democracy and the world's oldest democracy and upholding of democratic values and the liberal principle. So I'm just curious if that is going to feature, because both Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have an appeal that speaks to the majority of their own countries, whether it is a racial majority or a religious majority. They speak about the rise of the majority once again, because the minorities, whether they're immigrants or religious minorities or racial minorities, have had affirmative action, have had benefits, have had, in our case, appeasement, as you may see, which are, the protection of minorities is part of the democratic principle, it's part of the democratic ideal as well. So how are the two leaders going to engage on stuff like that? Or are we willing to say that the relationship is based on realpolitik, is transactional, the Americans want something, the Indians want something in return, and the talk of values and ideals and principles is kind of secondary.
Interesting. Well, we have a lot more to talk about tomorrow once the formal talks do take place. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us this evening for what is a preview, perhaps, of what to expect in the more substantive discussions tomorrow. We'll be back tomorrow night with a 1-hour special, in fact, on the Trump visit. See you then. Good night.